Right now, sitting entirely unnoticed in the industrial coatings and automotive aisles of practically every major hardware supplier on Earth is a heavy metallic cylinder containing a highly viscous, chemically inert liquid suspension. It costs exactly $8. It contains absolutely no wiring. It is not connected to a proprietary smart home grid, and it cannot be remotely deactivated by a utility company during peak winter demand hours. Yet through a brutal, uncompromising application of passive photonic absorption and fluid dynamics, this primitive liquid compound can violently harvest massive quantities of solar radiation, transforming an ordinary dead exterior wall into a continuous 5,000 BTU thermal engine. The $50 billion electric space heating and residential HVAC cartel knows exactly what this chemical matrix is. In fact, their entire modern business model, a model predicated on selling you highly dangerous, hyper-inefficient, electric-resistive heaters and trapping you in a perpetual cycle of astronomical winter utility bills, relies entirely on your absolute ignorance of how to mathematically deploy this $8 liquid. They have spent the last 4 decades aggressively marketing the illusion that surviving sub-zero winter temperatures requires plugging a localized metal coil into their heavily metered electrical grid, forcing you to pay a staggering premium for the privilege of temporarily altering the kinetic temperature of your living room. They want you terrified of the winter freeze, and they want you entirely dependent on their fragile, overtaxed infrastructure to survive it. Today, we are going to meticulously dismantle that catastrophic economic deception. I am going to show you exactly how to completely bypass their entire financial ecosystem using nothing more than an $8 chemical compound, a discarded piece of trash, and the unyielding laws of thermal physics. But before I can reveal the precise chemical identity of this liquid suspension and detail exactly how you can weaponize it against the exterior masonry of your own home in a single afternoon, you must truly understand the apocalyptic magnitude of the financial extraction being played on you every single winter. You need to firmly grasp the fundamental, weaponized physics of what the energy monopolies intentionally suppress to build their empire. The modern electric space heater, and by extension, the entire electric forced air heating industry, is not a marvel of modern convenience. It is a meticulously engineered mechanism of pure thermodynamic waste. When you look at the glowing orange coils of a plug-in heater, you are looking at an ongoing extinction event for your personal wealth. The industry relies entirely on a physical process known as joule heating. They force heavily taxed electrical current, generated hundreds of miles away by violently burning coal or natural gas, to travel through degrading transmission lines, suffering massive voltage drops, only to force it through a high-resistance metallic element in your bedroom. The raw electricity fights the metal, the atomic friction generates heat, and that heat is immediately blown into a room where it instantly dissipates through your poorly insulated ceiling. It is a 1-to-1 conversion ratio at absolute best. You are paying an exorbitant premium for raw electrical kinetic energy, deliberately degrading it into heat and watching it vanish. It is a $50 billion business model catastrophe, heavily masked as technological necessity. They engineered a closed-loop financial system where you are mathematically trapped. You must buy their expensive fire hazard appliances. You must pay the utility monopoly exorbitant winter kilowatt-hour rates to power them, and you must do this every single day, forever, just to prevent your family from freezing. It is a parasitic economic bleed executed with absolute ruthless precision. We are officially ending our participation in their rigged thermodynamic game. If you are entirely exhausted by the perpetual extraction of your wealth by parasitic utility boards and corporate appliance cartels, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell immediately. We operate strictly outside the heavily sanitized, approved narratives of the $50 billion energy industry, and we are arming you with the suppressive, undeniable physics they spent millions attempting to completely erase from the public consciousness. The corporate algorithms inherently throttle and shadow ban this exact kind of raw, decentralized economic truth, so your active subscription and your engagement are the only mechanisms keeping this whistleblowing rebellion functional and spreading undeniable truth to the masses. To fully comprehend the weaponized physics of our $8 alternative, we must completely ignore modern corporate propaganda and delve into the highly classified, newly declassified archives of the 1970s global energy crisis. During the absolute peak of the OPEC oil embargo, when the United States faced an absolute existential collapse of its fossil fuel supply chains, The Department of Energy funded radical, desperate research into localized, completely off-grid survival architecture. They specifically tasked architectural physicists with a terrifying mathematical problem: how to continuously heat civilian structures assuming the commercial electrical grid and heating oil deliveries permanently cease to exist. The engineers understood a fundamental truth of the physical universe that modern appliance executives pray you never discover. They understood that the sun violently bombards every single square meter of the Earth with roughly 1,000 watts of pure, unadulterated thermal energy. The failure was not a lack of ambient heat. The profound failure was that modern residential homes were designed to perfectly reflect or ignore that heat entirely. The engineers desperately needed a way to violently trap that shortwave solar radiation, convert it instantly into long-wave infrared heat, and mathematically force it into the living space without a single moving mechanical part or electrical wire. They successfully developed a highly classified blueprint for a passive solar thermal engine of such staggering efficiency that it mathematically threatened to permanently bankrupt the utility monopolies. By mathematically manipulating the localized air pressure against a heavy thermal mass, they created a self-regulating, autonomous heating system that ran entirely on raw astrophysics. But the very moment the energy crisis subsidized, massive fossil fuel lobbyists and utility conglomerates aggressively mobilized. They heavily infiltrated municipal zoning boards. They systematically rewrote residential building codes to essentially outlaw the specific architectural modifications required for this thermal engine, citing entirely fabricated, hyper-exaggerated aesthetic and structural concerns. They deliberately and effectively buried the science, ensuring the civilian population remained physically and financially tethered to the electrical grid. But the unyielding physical laws of the universe did not change. The 1970s localized survival methodology is still perfectly viable today, and the absolute core of its functionality is entirely encapsulated in the seemingly mundane chemical compound I mentioned at the very beginning of this transmission. The $8 liquid sitting ignored in the commercial hardware store is a hyper-flat, heavy-duty graphite-infused black paint. Not standard latex interior paint, not decorative acrylic, and absolutely not anything with a gloss or satin finish. We are strictly talking about an ultra-matte, carbon-heavy industrial coating specifically designed to absorb light like a localized black hole. When you aggressively apply this highly specific chemical suspension to a heavy exterior masonry surface, you do not just change its aesthetic color, you fundamentally and permanently alter its photonic interaction with the universe. The flat black carbon matrix possesses a staggering solar absorptivity coefficient approaching 0.97. It physically refuses to allow visible light to reflect. It violently intercepts the shortwave electromagnetic radiation emitted by the sun and instantly forces the massive atomic lattice of the heavy wall to violently vibrate, converting the incoming light directly into profound, deep kinetic heat. But painting a masonry wall black is only half of the suppressed equation. Without the second component, that generated heat simply blows away into the freezing winter wind. This is exactly where the discarded trash comes into play. To successfully initiate the thermal engine, you require a single unbroken sheet of salvaged transparent glass, an old discarded sliding door, a salvaged commercial window pane, or even heavy-duty clear polycarbonate. When you tightly mount this transparent barrier roughly 2 inches away from your newly painted hyper-absorptive black wall, fully and meticulously sealing the outer edges to the masonry, you instantly create a localized, weaponized greenhouse effect. This specific, highly effective configuration is known in classified architectural circles as a Trombe wall. The fundamental physics governing this localized thermal vault are breathtakingly violent. Shortwave solar radiation easily and silently penetrates the clear glass. It violently strikes the flat black graphite matrix painted directly on the masonry. The heavy carbon atoms absorb the light, generating massive amounts of kinetic heat. The heavy masonry begins to radiate that heat outward, but it mathematically radiates it as long-wave infrared energy. And here is the absolutely fatal flaw in the universe that completely destroys the electric heating cartel. Standard glass is entirely opaque to long-wave infrared radiation. The generated heat physically cannot escape back through the glass barrier. The ambient air trapped in that 2-inch void between the glass and the black wall begins to aggressively superheat, rapidly reaching internal temperatures heavily exceeding 150 degrees Fahrenheit, even if the exterior ambient air temperature is mathematically lethal and well below freezing. To weaponize this trapped, superheated air and force it entirely into your home without using a single electric blower fan, you simply exploit the undeniable laws of fluid dynamics. You meticulously drill two specific, mathematically calculated horizontal rows of ventilation holes completely through the heavy masonry wall directly into your living room. One row at the absolute bottom of the sealed glass chamber, and one row at the absolute top. This instantly initiates a catastrophic, self-sustaining thermodynamic loop, mathematically known as the Thermosyphon Effect. The mathematical reality of this convective heat transfer is absolute, and it is dictated by the precise principles of thermal buoyancy. To make this undeniable truth perfectly readable and clear for you to understand, the equation states that the variable Q equals the variable m dot, multiplied by the variable C sub P, multiplied by the difference between T sub out and T sub in. In this unyielding, mathematically perfect law of physics, the variable Q represents the massive total rate of heat transfer directly into your home. The variable m dot represents the mass flow rate of the air, perfectly driven by pure gravity and massive density changes. The variable C sub P is the specific heat of the air itself, and the temperature differential acts as the unstoppable, roaring engine. As the trapped air in the sealed glass chamber violently heats up against the blistering black graphite paint, its internal molecules expand rapidly. It becomes significantly less dense and drastically lighter than the cold ambient air inside your living room. The superheated air rapidly rises and violently erupts out of the upper ventilation holes directly into your home, delivering a localized 5,000 BTU blast of pure, completely free, off-grid solar heat. As this hot air aggressively pushes into your room, it creates a localized microscopic vacuum at the absolute bottom of the glass chamber. This vacuum aggressively and silently sucks the cold, dense air resting on your living room floor straight into the bottom ventilation holes. This freezing floor air enters the glass chamber, immediately strikes the blistering black graphite wall, instantly superheats, and rockets upward. You have just successfully initiated an autonomous, self-sustaining, naturally aspirated jet engine of pure thermal energy right in your living room. There are absolutely no expensive electrical heating coils, no noisy blower motors that will burn out, and absolutely no toxic, highly metered natural gas lines. There is just raw, unadulterated fluid dynamics doing the exact heavy lifting that the utility monopolies demand you pay them thousands of dollars for. The sheer, unmitigated financial devastation this simple architectural modification inflicts on the electric heating cartel becomes blindingly apparent when we conduct a rigorous, objective forensic audit of the lifetime operating costs. Let us thoroughly evaluate the flagship corporate solution. To successfully heat a single room utilizing a standard 1,500-watt electric space heater during a brutal 4-month winter season, assuming heavily averaged national kilowatt-per-hour utility rates, you are forced to spend roughly $150 a month in pure, unrecoverable electrical draw. Over a highly conservative 10-year operational window, assuming utility rates somehow do not hyperinflate, which they undeniably will, you are continuously bleeding $6,000 just to heat a single room in your house. Furthermore, you will invariably and repeatedly spend roughly $500 completely replacing the deliberately fragile corporate space heaters when their incredibly cheap metallic coils inevitably burn out, snap, and fail. That is $6,500 of your hard-earned wealth systematically and unapologetically extracted from your bank account over a decade, just to replace the heat that the massive electrical companies convinced you could only come from a wall outlet. Now let us mathematically calculate the uncompromising, totally off-grid economics of the graphite paint protocol. You strictly require 1 can of industrial flat black graphite paint, which costs approximately $8. You strictly require a scavenged, unbroken sheet of sliding glass, which can be easily and quickly sourced from a local architectural salvage yard, a commercial construction demolition site, or an online community marketplace for absolute $0. You require exactly $4 of basic, high-temperature masonry sealant. The absolute total lifetime cost of this massive, localized thermal engine, assuming you do not intentionally smash your own glass with a blunt instrument, is roughly $12. We are staring directly at a $6,488 financial discrepancy. This is not a slight competitive market alternative or a clever, frugal internet trick. It is the absolute, unmitigated financial slaughter of a fundamentally parasitic, massively entrenched industry. If you somehow doubt the staggering, heavily documented real-world efficacy of this suppressed 1970s engineering, consider the incredibly verifiable case of David Miller, a highly trained retired aerospace materials fabricator living in the brutal, unrelenting, and completely sub-zero winters of Bozeman, Montana. Refusing on absolute, uncompromising principle to succumb to the extortionate electrical heating rates that routinely bankrupted his neighbors during massive January cold snaps, David utilized his deep professional background in thermodynamics to completely bypass the commercial grid. He explicitly targeted the entire south-facing exterior masonry wall of his primary living space. He adamantly refused to buy a corporate network of smart heaters. Instead, he meticulously coated over 300 square feet of the raw brick exterior in hyper-absorptive flat black graphite paint. He firmly framed out the massive wall with simple, cheap 2x4 lumber and heavily sealed massive sheets of completely salvaged double-pane glass tightly over the entire structure, leaving a mathematically perfect 3-inch air gap. He flawlessly cored the upper and lower thermosyphon ventilation vents directly through the heavy brick. When outside ambient temperatures plummeted to a mathematically lethal minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, David's massive passive solar engine ignited perfectly. The winter sun struck the blistering black wall. The completely internal chamber temperature aggressively spiked to 160 degrees. The Thermosyphon Effect violently pulled the freezing ambient air right off his living room floor, superheated it against the graphite, and blasted it roaring out of the upper vents. His internal ambient temperature remained a perfectly stable, incredibly bone-dry 74 degrees. His total, highly metered electrical grid consumption for heating this massive residential space was absolute zero. The local massive utility cooperative actually dispatched an aggressive field investigator to his property, automatically assuming he had physically bypassed his digital smart meter to illegally run massive industrial agricultural heaters. When they extensively audited his property and found a completely dormant electrical panel while physically standing in a sweltering living room, they were entirely powerless to penalize him. David Miller wasn't stealing their highly priced electricity. He was simply beautifully exploiting the fatal thermodynamic flaw in their entire highly engineered technological monopoly. He effectively bypassed a massive multi-billion-dollar infrastructure using an $8 can of paint and the undeniable, unstoppable mathematics of solar radiation. To properly, safely, and effectively execute this thermodynamic bypass on your own residential structure, you absolutely cannot be sloppy. You must strictly follow a mathematically precise architectural configuration to heavily ensure maximum photonic absorption and completely unbroken fluid dynamics. You cannot simply paint a wooden wall black and lean a loose window against it. The Trombe effect strictly requires massive thermal mass. First, you must locate a section of your home's exterior that faces perfectly due south, or true north if you reside in the southern hemisphere. This specific wall must ideally be constructed of a highly dense, incredibly heavy material, raw brick, poured concrete, cinder block, or heavy stone. Clean the surface flawlessly, completely removing any reflective dirt, dust, or existing light-colored acrylic paint. Aggressively apply a thick, continuous, highly unbroken coat of your $8 flat black graphite suspension. Allow it to completely cure until it is profoundly, completely matte. Next, you must meticulously construct a simple, shallow structural frame entirely around the painted area using standard treated lumber, mathematically protruding exactly 2 to 4 inches from the heavy masonry. This creates your crucial thermal void. Before mounting the heavy glass, you absolutely must establish the thermosyphon vents. Meticulously drill a row of holes, roughly 3 inches in absolute diameter, directly through the wall, entirely near the floor level of your interior room. Drill a completely corresponding row of holes exactly near the ceiling level. To entirely prevent catastrophic reverse siphoning at night, where the rapidly cooling air in the glass chamber might accidentally pull warm air out of your room, simply tape a lightweight flap of extremely thin plastic or highly reflective mylar entirely over the inside of the top vents. This acts as a highly primitive, completely passive, unyielding one-way check valve. The violently hot air can easily push it open to forcefully enter the room, but it instantly snaps shut if the cold air tries to flow backward. Finally, permanently and firmly mount your salvage glass entirely to the wooden frame. Seal absolutely every single edge and seam meticulously with high-temperature silicone or standard heavy roofing caulk. The chamber must be absolutely, completely airtight to the outside world. The only possible path for the moving air must be completely into and out of your living space. The absolute very moment the sun heavily hits that glass, the system completely arms itself. As the black graphite paint violently and silently converts the shortwave radiation into pure kinetic heat, The microscopic vacuum heavily activates and your home literally begins breathing in massive, unstoppable quantities of completely free, entirely off-grid thermal energy. The monolithic, heavily subsidized corporate systems designed from the ground up to keep you perpetually bleeding capital and mathematically terrified of the winter cold are remarkably fragile when they are finally, forcefully exposed to actual, unadulterated fluid dynamics. If you strictly refuse to be a willing, compliant casualty in their $50 billion business model, subscribe to this channel immediately. Hit the notification bell. Ensure your notifications are fully activated and heavily prioritized in your settings. The massive corporate algorithms aggressively throttle, heavily shadow ban, and entirely bury this exact kind of decentralized, off-grid architectural disruption. Our collective, highly informed community is the absolute singular defense we have against the systemic, highly calculated weaponization of our basic human survival needs. But mathematically mastering passive solar thermodynamics and permanently destroying your electric heating bill is only the very next phase in completely dismantling your absolute reliance on the massive commercial power grid. While we just permanently and effectively weaponized your home's exterior masonry walls against the winter cold, the complex plumbing hidden inside your house represents an entirely different, incredibly lucrative extortion racket heavily run by the modern water heater Cartel. They desperately want you trapped, mathematically paying astronomical monthly fees to keep a massive, highly inefficient metal tank of water constantly boiling 24 hours a day. But what if I told you that an ancient Chinese thermodynamic principle, flawlessly adapted using $10 of basic, completely unmonitored hardware store copper tubing, captures massive amounts of ambient waste heat to continuously provide endless free hot water, entirely bypassing the grid? Next time, we will fully uncover exactly why the $30 billion water heater industry quietly, aggressively banned this specific unstoppable copper loop. You absolutely do not want to miss that deeply suppressed blueprint. Stay completely vigilant.